11 world-class contenders. Take them down with your controller, beat them all, and you've got a shot at Tyson's title.
Mike Tyson's Punch-Out takes a relatively simple concept and executes it in a nearly flawless and truly special way. It features simple gameplay mechanics, over-the-top memorable characters, and a lasting challenge that still taunts players to this day. Some even regard Mike Tyson as one of the hardest boss fights in the history of video games. Players are also still finding out secrets decades after its initial release. Let's take a closer look at this classic, from its roots in the arcades to its lasting memories on the Nintendo Entertainment System. It's Mike Tyson's Punch-Out on this edition of Friday Night Arcade. When most people think of Punch-Out, they probably go back to the 1987 classic released on the Nintendo Entertainment System that featured boxing champion Mike Tyson. However, Punch-Out originated in the arcades. Nintendo developed and released the arcade machine simply titled Punch-Out, first releasing it in Japan in 1983 and then later in Europe and North America in 1984. The general manager of Nintendo's Integrated Research and Development Division, Junio Takada, created the game alongside Makoto Wada. It's worth noting that Takada and Wada were also responsible for the creation of another short-lived series that is very near to my heart, Star Tropics. The arcade version of Punch-Out is actually the memory I most go back to when I think of the series and not the NES version.
Body blow! Body blow! Knock him out! Left! Body blow! Body blow! Knock him out! Come on! Come on! Uppercut!
Every Wednesday when I was a kid, my family and I would go to the local bowling alley which had a Punch-Out arcade machine. Controlling this green wire frame dude and trying to knock the other guy out, that's Punch-Out to me. I never got very far in this version, although there wasn't too far to go. The game featured just 6 opponents, and technically if you managed to beat them all, it would just keep looping back through them until you lost or ran out of quarters. In this version, it actually wasn't possible to win a fight by decision. The only way to win was either by knockout or if you could manage to knock your opponent down 3 times. Nobody ever gets up after a 3rd knockdown. The game featured impressive graphics for the time, as well as digitized speech and realistic crowd noises. All of the elements combined to create an intoxicating big boxing match atmosphere that is still seared into the brains of anyone who played it to this day. Later that same year, Nintendo developed and released the arcade follow-up Super Punch-Out. This version featured fewer opponents than the first one, but several of these boxers would go on to become quite memorable recurring characters in the series. Nintendo later went on to release a special gold cartridge of Punch-Out in Japan for the Famicom as part of a Nintendo Famicom Golf tournament in 1987. Only 10,000 of these special cartridges were ever produced, and they are highly sought after by collectors, often going for several $100s on the secondary markets. This version of the game had a few minor differences in gameplay and sound to the Tyson version that would be released a few months later, and also featured a different final boss fight. As the NES and Famicom systems were skyrocketing in popularity, Nintendo readied the retail release of a home version of its popular boxing arcade game, but it was still missing one crucial element which would ultimately catapult it into the status of legend: the game's namesake. While younger audiences of today may be more relatable to combat sports such as mixed martial arts and the UFC, in the 80s, the sport of boxing was still flourishing. Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, and Evander Holyfield were dominant in their craft and household names for most sports fans. In the late 80s, a young man out of Brooklyn began turning heads as he seemingly walked through the competition and started climbing his way up the boxing ranks almost without effort. His appearance, menacing. His punches, devastating. His name, Mike Tyson. Nintendo of America president Minoru Arakawa saw one of Tyson's fights in 1986 and was so enamored by Tyson's physical dominance and otherworldly athletic prowess that he insisted they retain the rights to use his name and likeness in the upcoming Punch-Out release. For the paltry fee of just $50,000, Nintendo secured the rights for 3 years to call it Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. And not only would Tyson's name be on the box, but he would actually be featured as the final boss of the game, touted as the dream fight. In real life, Tyson was 31-0 and became heavyweight champion right around the time of the game's release. With Tyson at the seemingly peak of his popularity and athletic skill, he was the perfect final ingredient to make this game fly off the shelves. So how does this game actually work? You play as Little Mac, a small-time boxer working his way up through the ranks of the World Video Boxing Association. Mac even looks tiny, but there was actually a valid reason for this. He was a larger wireframe character that you could see through, but the NES wasn't really capable of pulling that off, so they just made him smaller to avoid blocking the view of your opponent. It also gives Little Mac a kind of rugged underdog feel that probably benefited from the Rocky films of the 80s, a series of films starring Sylvester Stallone as an underdog boxer who goes on a series of title fights. You control Little Mac by dodging left or right with the D-pad, and you can press down to block. The A and B buttons execute left and right body blow punches, and if you hold up while pressing A or B, you'll go for a higher punch to the face. You've got a stamina bar as well as a heart meter. If your heart meter gets down to 0, your character gets winded and all you can do is dodge while your opponent attacks, but you are unable to throw a punch. You lose hearts by taking damage or if one of your punches gets blocked. You can also occasionally get stars during fights. If you have a star, you can push the start button to unleash a massive uppercut. If you get knocked down, you have to frantically tap the A and B buttons to try and get back up. These game mechanics were ridiculously simple, yet strikingly complex once you actually start playing the game, as each opponent has their own series of fighting patterns. The game gives you this simple series of rules, and then it's up to you, the player, to figure out the pattern and execute the plan of attack to overcome your opponent. Speaking of which, a large part of what makes Punch-Out so memorable is the cadre of hilariously over-the-top and cartoonish opponents you have to take on as you progress through the boxing circuits. The game is nice enough to put you up against Glass Joe at the beginning. He's an aging boxer who's only won 1 fight out of 100. This is as close as you're going to get to a tutorial for the game, as he's pretty easy to take down. But after that, the difficulty really ramps up. Von Kaiser and his righteous mustache, Piston Honda and his Honda Dash attack, Don Flamenco and his Flamenco punch, King Hippo and his, well, I mean, look at him, he's freaking huge. And they all had some sort of specific pattern, typically with some sort of telegraph of their special move. With a little practice, you could figure out the exact time to land a punch and do serious damage. For example, Piston Honda steps back just before doing his piston punches, and he twitches his eyebrow just a bit before throwing a jab. Wait for his eyebrow to twitch, dodge the jabs, and then go in for some jabs of your own. King Hippo seems nearly indestructible when you first face him, but he also has a tell of his own. When he opens his mouth, punch him in the mouth, which will cause his pants to fall down, exposing a bandaged navel. You can then go in for some rapid low punches of your own. These characters all just seem to take on a life of their own and go beyond just being standard bad guys in a video game. As you progress, the characters get more and more over the top. Great Tiger has a pet tiger and wears a turban to the ring that lights up just before his special move. Soda Popinski was modified a bit from his arcade form. He was originally known as Vodka Drunkinski, a vodka-swilling Russian. This was changed in the home console version for obvious reasons. The taunts from the opposing boxers were also amusingly mean-spirited. That's another thing. Between each round, the opponent taunts you while you're getting terrible advice from your coach, who always looks like he's completely terrified. Join the Nintendo Fun Club? Gee, thanks for the tip, coach. No, seriously, this guy's useless. The only good thing here is that if you hold the select button on this screen, you can get a little bit of an energy boost in the next round. It only works once per fight though, so in a 3-round fight, you'll want to pick and choose your spots. Anyway, the taunting. They changed Vodka Drunkinski's name, but they didn't change any of his taunts, and he spouts off gems like, "I can't drive, but I'm going to walk all over you. After you lose, we'll drink to your health." He's just talking about soda, right? Great Tiger says, "So, a pussycat wants to fight a tiger, eh?" Nothing can quite compare to the experience of getting your butt kicked by a heavily stereotyped opponent and then rubbing your nose in it for a little kid playing video games in the 80s. Eventually, you'll make your way to one of the most imposing bosses in history. And no, it's not who you think. You know who I'm talking about. Standing in at 6'2", 298 pounds, Bald Bull is one of the meanest, fiercest opponents of all time. For most players, myself included, this was usually where Little Mac's story ended. When he goes in for his bull charge attack, it typically spells doom for the unsuspecting player the first couple of times through. Even if you manage to dodge it, he'll just keep doing it over and over again until one of you is knocked down for good. However, if you time a body blow just right during his bull attack, you can actually knock him down with one blow. Makoto Wada revealed a secret about the first Bald Bull fight that nobody knew about for 22 years. There's a camera flash that goes off in the lower right corner of the crowd during his bull attack, and if you punch right when it flashes, you'll easily land a body blow and win the fight. Fun fact, Bald Bull is the only fighter in the game that must be defeated by knockout. It's not possible to win by decision, and in the Bald Bull rematch he always gets up after the 9 count. There are some other quirks and tells like this too that aren't always obvious. One such tell wasn't discovered for nearly 30 years. A Reddit user that goes by Midwestern Housewives posted a video on YouTube showing that in the rematch with Piston Honda, if you look closely at this bearded guy in the lower left corner of the crowd, he ducks right when Piston Honda goes in for a special attack. If you time a punch just right after the guy ducks, you can knock Piston Honda out with one blow. The same thing happens in the rematch with Bald Bull, and you can time a knockout blow right when the same bearded guy in the audience ducks. Who would figure out something like that? I mentioned rematches with certain characters, and that's another thing about this game. To save space on the cartridge, they occasionally just had you face the same opponent again a little later in the game, this time with an increased difficulty. You have rematches with Don Flamenco, Piston Honda, and Bald Bull. They also pulled a bit of digital trickery by having some of the characters swap palettes. Glass Joe looks like Don Flamenco, Von Kaiser and Great Tiger, Bald Bull and Mr. Sandman, Soda Popinski and Super Macho Man. Also, Mario's the referee, and he's a crooked, no-good cheater. I swear, he purposely slow counts from time to time. So, what makes this game so great? Well, all of the above. On the surface, it seems like a simple little concept, but it's all executed to perfection. The controls are straightforward and easy to understand. The music and crowd noises are just the right mix to draw you into the fight. The over-the-top bosses provide memorable experiences. Almost everyone has their own memory to share from fighting these insane characters. The timing and patterns are tough to pick up at first, but it's incredibly satisfying once you overcome the challenge and defeat the other boxers. Who doesn't remember the first time they were able to successfully dodge Great Tiger's tornado punches and finally knock him out? And the adrenaline rush of getting knocked out and having to wildly mash the A and B buttons to get Little Mac back to his feet, this all just works. It's perfect. And then, if you can somehow make it through each circuit and defeat all of the other boxers, you get rewarded with the game's namesake dream fight, a championship match against the one and only Iron Mike Tyson. There he is, a menacing 8-bit monstrosity that for just about all players represents an unstoppable NES boss for the ages. His body may have been a palette swap of Piston Honda, but it didn't matter. It was technically achievable to beat Mike Tyson, either by decision or by knockout, but it may as well have been impossible because this guy was notoriously brutal. Seriously, this is it. If you want a challenge, fight Mike Tyson in Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. Even the best of the best will probably end up throwing their controller in a fit of rage. Up to this point, your opponents had some sort of pattern that could be figured out and exploited with a reasonable amount of practice, but Tyson has no straightforward pattern. He has certain attacks that he uses, but his timing is all over the place and it forces you to just be better at the game. You can't predict his moves, you just literally have to react. You'll need to master the controls, have lightning fast reflexes, and you'll probably also need a little bit of luck. It's definitely not something you'll be able to do in a few hours or possibly even a few weeks. Truth be told, I still can't beat this guy. If you pulled it off without cheating in some way, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. But I just couldn't do it, no matter how hard I tried. contract Mike Tyson had with Nintendo only lasted 3 years, after which time Nintendo was no longer able to use his likeness in the game. Tyson was swapped out for a character called Mr. Dream that was essentially the same guy and same difficulty level, and the game was resold with the title of Punch-Out! Oddly enough, there technically was a sequel to this game that featured a boxer that totally wasn't Mike Tyson, called Power Punch 2. This was developed by Beam Software under the supervision of Nintendo. This time you play as Mark, tough guy, Tyler, totally not Mike Tyson, and you have to travel through the universe beating up all of these alien boxers. It was originally going to be Mike Tyson's Intergalactic Power Punch, but after Tyson's personal life fell apart, they changed the name and took out all references to Tyson. Nintendo wasn't happy with the final version of the game, although it did eventually get officially published by ASC Games. Other sequels in the series were released, including a Super Punch-Out game on the Super NES, a Wii version of Punch-Out in 2009, and a different Doc Lewis's Punch-Out was released for free to certain North American Nintendo Club members. There were also a few spin-offs, such as the 1985 arcade machine Arm Wrestling. In 1985, there was also an unofficial port of the Super Punch-Out arcade game on the Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, and Amstrad called Frank Bruno's Boxing. Although I certainly enjoyed the Super Nintendo version of Punch-Out, and the Wii release rekindled much nostalgia among gamers, nothing ever quite matched the success of the NES release of Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! It went on to sell over 3 million copies during its original run and is fondly remembered by gamers as well as critics. Nintendo Power ranked it as the 6th greatest NES game of all time out of a library of over 700 officially licensed releases, and it ranks fairly highly on just about any other similar list. It's a must-have for any retro gaming enthusiast, and if you've somehow missed it after all these years, I highly recommend picking it up and giving it a try. After all, Mike Tyson is waiting for your challenge. Well, what do you think? What are some of your greatest memories with Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! I'd love to hear how far you got in this game, whether as a kid or if you went back and tried again after 30 years. Hey, I do this sort of thing all the time here on this channel. If you enjoyed this, here's a playlist of other NES videos that you might also like, and you can subscribe for new videos all the time. You can also come hang out with me in a more casual setting on my Let's Play channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Friday Night Arcade.